In the realms of top secret projects of World War II, there are a couple which most people will have heard about. The development of the atomic bomb with the Manhattan Project and radar. But there was another which was ranked as equally important and secret, and its effect on the war could have been said to have been greater than that of the atomic bomb, and yet few outside of the military knew about it until after the war. This is the story of the proximity fuse, one of the best kept secrets of World War II, and regarded by some as the third most important technological development after the atomic bomb and radar. This is how they worked and how this simple principle changed the outcome of the war. Our sponsor for this video is Morning Brew, and no, it's not a brand of coffee, but you might like to grab a cup as you get a head start on your day and find out what's going on in the world instead of aimlessly scrolling through all those social media posts first thing in the morning. Morning Brew is a free daily newsletter that brings you the latest news on a whole range of subjects in an informative, witty and relevant manner. For example, I just found out about Amazon's reportedly $9 billion acquisition of MGM Studios, and that would add franchises like James Bond, Rocky and RoboCop to the Amazon Prime stable, and Ford's unveiling of its all-electric F-150 Lightning pickup truck as the switch to electric vehicles picks up speed. Now, if you're interested in business, finance or tech, then there's no reason not to subscribe to Morning Brew. It's completely free, it takes less than 15 seconds to subscribe, and all you need to do is just click on the link in the description below to get smarter in 5 minutes every day. During the early German air raids on Britain, an anti-aircraft gunner is reported to have said that shooting down an aircraft in the night sky was akin to trying to hit a fly in a darkened room with a pea shooter. According to reports of the time, it took around 1,000 shells to bring down one aircraft. With the advent of radar fire control and variable time fuses, this was said to be around 500 shells, but these were very low estimates. Some sources said that it could have been as high as 20,000 shells. Either way, it was very inefficient and seen by some as just harassment of the German bombers rather than an effective weapon. The device that controls when the shell, rocket or bomb explodes is called a fuse. And on a shell, for example, it fits into the top of a shell, and different types of fuses are available depending on how you want the shell to operate. At the beginning of the war, anti-aircraft shells used either direct contact fuses, which only worked if they hit the target, or mechanical variable time or VT fuses. These triggered a timer once the shell was fired and then detonated after a predetermined time. This allowed the gunners to place the detonations at a specific altitude, one which was determined through observation and radar, and where they thought the enemy aircraft were flying in at. But this was far from ideal because each one had to be set by hand to the correct time before use, and then 10 to 15 or so would need to be fired to confirm the altitude settings. These could be seen by the enemy, which could move up or down to then avoid them. If the timing of the fuse was out by a second either way, it would result in the shells detonating harmlessly hundreds of meters above or below the target. The problem wasn't new, and various ideas were put forward in the 1930s for ways of getting shells to detonate when they got close to a target. The British had worked on radar-guided shells, which could be exploded by a radio signal when they were seen to be near an aircraft on a radar screen, but this proved to be too difficult to accurately control. What was needed was a way for the shells themselves to sense the aircraft and then detonate when they were close enough. Another idea the British came up with was to use a tiny transmitter in the fuse of the shell. This would transmit a constant radio signal. This would radiate outwards and be reflected off anything like an aircraft which came within range. The reflected radio waves would be picked up by the body of the fuse, which was also the antenna. The difference between this and the transmitted signal created a beat frequency which increased as the shell and the fuse got closer to the target. This was amplified, filtered, and then when it reached a preset amplitude, triggered an electronic switch, a pyrotron, which started the detonation process. As the amplitude of the Thyratron trigger signal was proportional to the distance from the target, it could be tuned to certain distances, usually around 6 to 20 meters before it detonated the shell, showering the target in shrapnel. There was just one problem. The acceleration forces experienced by a shell at setback or when it's fired are in the region of 20,000 G. But that's not all. The shells are also fired along rifled barrels, which imparts a spin to them, which could be up to 30,000 revolutions per minute, creating very large centrifugal forces too. Now, today this wouldn't be a problem with our modern solid-state transistors and ICs, but back then all they had were glass vacuum tubes, which were large and delicate and would break easily if you dropped a radio on the floor, let alone exposing them to 20,000 G. Although the British did develop miniature ruggedized tubes, this was still a major problem, so most of the British work moved towards fuses for rockets and bombs, which had G-forces of less than 100. The British plans for the fuses were also part of the Tizard mission, which gave the US many top-secret British project plans for further development and production in case England was invaded by Germany. Over in the US in 1940, scientists at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, working with both the Navy and Army research labs, had come up with a new modified design with a separate transmitter and receiver circuits. But crucially, they had access to miniature vacuum tubes, which were initially made for hearing aid amplifiers that could fit into a top pocket. To test the effects of acceleration, they placed a fly into an empty shell and fired it vertically. When they recovered the shell from the ground, the fly was nowhere to be seen. It was only when they inspected it very carefully they found a slight residue left on the inside of the shell, and that was all that remained of the fly. With such extreme accelerations, the mass of the electronic components became the limiting factor. The smaller they were, the better they would perform and the more reliable they would be. Together with miniature tubes and smaller ruggedized resistors and capacitors, the total mass reduction was in the order of 10 times that of a conventional tube design. Even things like the solder for the joints, which would normally be made from lead and tin, would become an issue with such G-forces. So a special type of solder had to be used that was only available from England. 4 vacuum tubes were used in the design to both transmit and receive the signal, amplify it, and then trigger the detonation. Some of the tubes were optimized with a planar electrode design, which made them more sturdy. You might well have thought that wrapping the glass tubes and electronics in a shock-absorbing layer would be enough, but this could actually induce vibrations with multiple harmonic resonances, which could then shatter the glass and damage the other electronic components. So the whole assembly would need to be as solid as possible, so they were potted with a special wax that set hard. Now, having an electronically controlled fuse that was sensitive to almost anything around it would be a major problem when being handled on the battlefield. The last thing you wanted was it detonating in the gun barrel, or if it was dropped, for example. So there were 5 safety features built into the design. Firstly, normal dry cell batteries were a problem. They had a limited shelf life, and the fuses needed to be ready for use without any further work required once they'd left the factory. Instead of a normal dry cell battery, they used an ampule of acid which broke on firing and activated the battery. The spin imparted from the rifle barrel then made sure the acid was distributed within the battery. The squib, a small electrically operated explosive that triggered the detonator, was shorted out with a mercury switch so that it wouldn't work until the fuse started rotating at speed as it travelled along the gun barrel. And an out-of-line powder train between the squib and the detonator only came into line once the shell was spinning. To stop premature detonation in the barrel, or as the shell passed over friendly forces, a time delay was incorporated into the capacitor discharge circuit that fired the squib. This gave enough time for the shell to be far enough away before it could detonate. And to stop the fuse, which was top secret at the time from falling into enemy hands, a mechanical spin switch was activated by the rotation of the shell. If the squib discharge capacitor was charged and the shell had not come near an enemy target, the spin would slow down, and this would trigger the switch to self-destruct the shell and the fuse. In fact, up until the D-Day landings, the use of proximity fuses was only allowed over water, so if any did fail, they would be lost in the sea. After the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941, testing and production of the fuses were given a top priority, and work continued through 1942. Although 20% of the shells fired failed to work, the others proved to be very effective against target drones. So much so that the range commander, where the tests were being performed, complained that they were destroying too many of his drones. After a great deal of testing and refinement, they were ready to be used in the Pacific against the Japanese aircraft. On the 5th of January 1943, the cruiser Helena, using 5-inch shells with proximity fuses, was the first to shoot down a dive bomber as it approached the ship with 2 salvos of shells. Soon they were being used by many of the ships in the region with spectacular results. In May 1945, the destroyers Evan and Hadley were off the coast of Okinawa when over 150 kamikaze aircraft attacked both ships. Using proximity fuses, all the attacking aircraft were shot down, with just 6 partially destroyed aircraft or parts of them getting through to hit the ships. According to the official report, the horizon from the east to the northwest was filled with burning planes. After the war, the Japanese stated that the uncanny accuracy of the US anti-aircraft guns to destroy their dive bombers without actually hitting them was one of the reasons why they started using kamikaze attacks. And though they suspected something like a proximity fuse was being used, they didn't know how the Americans were doing it. Proximity fuses also worked at low altitudes, as they would detect the ground just as well as an aircraft as they fell back to Earth, so they could be used to detonate above the heads of the enemy on the battlefield. This removed the safety provided by trenches and foxholes. With a normal artillery barrage, the shells exploded when they hit the ground, expending most of their energy and shrapnel upwards. Troops could be protected if they were dug in, even if they were quite near a shell blast. The Japanese on many Pacific islands withstood huge artillery bombardments for weeks using this method. But now, with shells that could be set to detonate just 5 to 10 metres above the ground, troops in open trenches or foxholes would be hit by the shrapnel exploding just above them. This was used by the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge when the Germans were using the dense forests in the area for cover during the attack. One report stated that after an artillery barrage with proximity shells, the forest looked like a giant scythe had cut the tops of the trees off, destroying everything above 40 feet or 12 metres and killing almost everyone under the barrage. On the open battlefield, the same tactic was used with lines of synchronised artillery fire. Smaller mortars at the front, then larger guns behind, and then howitzers at the rear, firing staggered barrages over the artillery troops, all to explode above the German positions at the same time. This could also be used to attack on the far side of a hill where enemy forces would be hiding, with similar results. This was so terrifying that many of the Germans abandoned their positions because of the effectiveness of the airbursts above them. Bombs dropped from planes using proximity fuses were used against anti-aircraft batteries to great effect to demoralise the gun crews over Italy, silencing the guns and allowing the US Air Force to proceed uncontested. As the Allies advanced through Germany from the Rhine to Berlin, Allied anti-aircraft fire with proximity shells downed over 1,000 enemy aircraft. Proximity fused shells were also used to great effect against the V-1 flying bomb attacks on London. In one day, of the 104 V-1s launched, 68 were shot down with proximity shells, 14 by the RAF, 2 by barrage balloons and cables, and 16 suffered mechanical failure during their flight. After the war and during the trials that followed, the Germans, like the Japanese, revealed that they had no idea proximity weapons were being used against them. The Germans themselves did in fact develop a variety of different types of proximity fuses for bombs and rockets, but few went into production, and no one considered making them for shells, which the Allies used to such great advantage because they didn't believe the electronics could survive the forces involved. Over 20 million proximity fuses were produced during the war. The effect that these fuses had on the outcome of the war in both the Pacific and Europe was one of the best kept secrets of the war until they were eventually revealed several years later, and the technology would go on to create guided missiles like the Sidewinder we looked at previously. So I hope you found the video interesting, and if you did, then don't forget to subscribe, click the bell notification, thumbs up and share. And I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of our patrons for their ongoing support.